I couldn't go this long without mentioning the series' embarrassingly slow fights very early in the review. A complaint I'm sure most of you were already familiar with anyway. But yes, the Ultraman and monster suits, though very impressive in their designs, were extremely fragile, which forced the crew to dull the choreography down to a mediocre level. The budget was super low and the schedule was non-existent, so if the suits got too badly damaged or torn, there was no time or money to piece them back together. Why they couldn't just film the stuntmen fighting slowly, then increasing the speed of the footage in post-production is anyone's guess, but alas, that's not what we got in the end. Since most, if not all, of the Ultra fanbase is so dedicated to the fast-moving style of the fights in the series, this one flaw is why so many fans have chosen to distance themselves from Powered over the years. Now, who designed the suits? What kind of background did they have? Did they ever manage to work again after this? Well, cool your heads and keep your shorts on, because if you remember what I said at the beginning of this review, several members of the crew did have a promising resume before working on the show, and yes, a lot of them did manage to move up to bigger and better things. Two of these men were the American and Japanese effects artists Kevin Hudson, who constructed the Monster and Ultraman suits, and Shinji Higuchi, who developed the concept art and design for the monsters and technology of the series. Before Ultraman Powered, Kevin Hudson had worked on the effects for movies like Star Trek VI and Batman Returns, and after Ultraman Powered, he continued doing effects work for Contact, Stuart Little, The Polar Express, Superman Returns, and The Dark Knight Rises, and in 2017, he made his debut as a writer-director for an animated short film called Weeds. While Shinji Higuchi started his career on other tokusatsu films and animations like The Return of Godzilla and Wings of Honea Misei, and later did the effects for the Heisei Gamera trilogy, the Tokyo production coordinator for Kill Bill Volume 1, and then co-directed Shin Godzilla. Higuchi didn't speak good English, and Hudson spoke virtually no Japanese, but since they were both artists and huge Godzilla fans, they were able to find ways to communicate through natural improvisations which proved that a barrier between languages was almost imaginary, and it made their experience on this low-budget production piece all the more exciting. When it came to designing the titular hero's costume, the effects crew wanted a suit with more of a sculptural feel to it that would make it different from the wetsuit or spandex suits that were used in past Ultraman shows. So, in this case, the Powered suit was sculpted out of Shavant clay, which is a clay used for sculpting cars. The sculpture was then molded in fiberglass, and foam latex was injected inside. It was then baked onto a custom spandex suit that was fitted to Scott Rogers. The suits were then seamed and painted with red and aluminum paints. They constructed a suit for each episode, and also made 3 to hang on the side as spares, for a grand total of 16 Powered suits. These costumes for the hero were made by industry professionals who worked on films like Batman Returns, Predator 2, Star Trek VI, and Edward Scissorhands, to name a few. The suit ultimately turned out to be a very sharp, modern aesthetic. The problem that came with it, unfortunately, aside from being very fragile, was that it was hard to move around in, it cut off blood circulation, was hard to breathe in, and got hot extremely quickly. All 16 of the suits came out like this. It had to be given tubes and a special vest filled with ice so the actor could breathe easier, lower the risk of heat stroke, and pad out the suit. In some shots, you can actually see the tubes push against the suit because of how tight it was. The mechanics for the creatures were handled by Wes Seifer, and believe it or not, this was not his only involvement with an Americanized adaptation of a popular Japanese franchise. He later provided the mechanics for the remodeled design of Goldar and Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and then later did the mechanical effects for the 1998 American remake to Godzilla.
Damn!
A little ironic, given that 2 of these Americanized entries have left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, while the other one is still celebrated as an iconic relic from our childhood. The monster suits themselves were made by a design team headed by Lynette Johnson, who used foam latex to mold the material. The foam, mind you, was actually large sheets of couch foam, which was then glued to form the basic body. while the head and hands were mostly sculpted. This foam fabrication held together at first, but got damaged the more they were slammed around, hence why the fights looked like they were coordinated by a guy who just downed 3 bottles of expensive Russian vodka, to reduce additional wears and tears being done to the rubbery props. The suits needed to be kept to a manageable weight to allow as much maneuverability as possible. Kevin Hudson said he tried on one of the suits to see what it was like, and described the experience as like walking around in a sauna. To brave themselves against the heat, the stuntmen wore a cool suit underneath, which is basically a vest that has cool water pumping through it. He also said that most of the team in the creature shop, at some time or other, tried on a monster suit to live out their own Godzilla fantasy. And really, can you blame them? It should also be noted that the monster scenes were filmed not on a soundstage, but outdoors, on a miniaturized set placed on a parking lot perched in the hills above Burbank, in the middle of summer, where the temperatures were well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Can you imagine how stifling it must have been to work in those suits with so much heat exposure? Kevin Hudson even recalled that when he'd helped Scott Rogers out of the Ultraman suit at the end of each day, the suit was completely soaked in sweat since it was basically a big body-fitting sponge. Quick reminder, the sets themselves, such as the control room of Winter HQ and the Hawks, likewise got ridiculously hot and very quickly, forcing the crew to film each scene as fast as possible without smothering the cast and crew. So basically, no one was safe from being boiled alive on this set. By the way, remember when I said the suits were painted with aluminum paint? Well, would you like to know a little trivia about aluminum paint? Aluminum paint is said to be very, very flammable. According to a document I came across, the hazards associated with this particular type of paint, once ignited, are vapors that may form explosive mixtures with the air. Vapors are heavier than air and may travel along the floor and accumulate in the bottom of containers. Vapors may be ignited by a spark, a hot surface, or an ember. And the crew had their stuntmen acting out their scenes in suits coated with this hazardous material. But I'm sure they all knew what they were doing. Surely they were cautious and humble enough to be aware of these dangers and kept their men away from something so hazardous to the suit's material like fire, right? Right? The pyrotechnics, such as the explosions and the fire-breathing effects, were done by Joe Fiscosil, who did the special effects for Star Wars long before his attachment to the Ultra series. Imagine building a resume that says you were almost turned into a plate of fried chicken by the guy who did this. And the problems weren't relegated to just the paint of the suits. Oh no, the production couldn't be that clean and smooth. The helmet of Ultraman Powered, which was sculpted by Bruce Fuller, who also constructed many of the show's suits, had its own little share of issues. The helmet for each suit was made of fiberglass, and electronics were built into the prop to power the lights in the eyes. Oh, and the inside of the mask had exposed wiring in it that dangled extremely close to the actor's face. Wires that could either burn the face of the actor if he came in contact with them, or could cause the whole helmet to burst into flames, setting his head on fire in the process.
Oh my god, his hair's on fire!
You know, when Haruo Nakajima was playing the Toho monsters from 1954 to 1972, he never complained and always treated every incident, every task, every scenario like it was just another day at the office. If ever he got injured, he made sure absolutely no one knew about it. Yet, something tells me that, if he'd been involved with this show, even he would have had the gumption to speak up about this kind of monotony going on around him on set. As for the rest of the effects, they have some hits, but also a lot of misses. The Hawks look pretty cool, and actually fly more convincingly than the Hummers from Ultraman Great. Though, if you look closely in certain shots, you can spot the crane that guided them through the air. Also, it's sometimes kind of hard to distinguish their size when they interact with other objects. They're launched from the command ship, which has to be gargantuan in order to store them inside. But in some shots, like this one, the Hawks are all of a sudden about the same size as the ship. Past Ultraman shows had a pair of vehicles that the series' hero team would use for ground patrol, usually with their own unique design. For Powered, the winter team just uses a plain old Hummer. The effects team made specialized Defense Force cars, but they were deemed too ugly and didn't drive very well. Since there was no money to build another model, they just rented an ordinary Hummer for the show. The model cities look alright when they're filmed at decent angles and with the right kind of lighting, but in other shots, they look cheap and like they were lazily stacked together on the sets. In some of the nighttime shots, the buildings look even less convincing because of the lights being generated from within, which just made the whole set look like something a guy put together in his bedroom for an Ultraman fan flick. Sometimes, when a monster bumped into them, they would flip over like they were made of cardboard or paper. It sure would have been nice to see the monsters actually smash some of the miniatures to bits, as is tradition for tokusatsu, but instead we get random pyrotechnics going off in various spots away from the buildings that don't look like they're really being damaged by the explosions at all. Speaking of which, why do we almost never see any screaming people running from the attacks? Occasionally, you'll spot only small clusters of people running about, but almost never in large masses, except for this one shot in Gamora's episode. But when Zambalar attacked a town, we hear people screaming, but we never actually see them. I don't understand why they film these shots like this. Oh wait, yes I do. Because extras cost money, and the crew had none of that to spare. Kevin Hudson said the director, King Wilder, and his wife, Julie Avola, one of the show's American producers, were totally committed to making the show the best it could be. It was a huge project, and we had only a small budget, but I think every dollar shows on screen. Oh, every buck shows its face on screen, alright. I promise you that, Kevin. Some of it is pretty darn wicked for a low-budget job. Other elements, however, are what prompted me to make this retrospective in the first place. For starters, you gotta love how cheap this remote control tank looks. Or this car that doesn't have a license plate. Wait, did Teleston just move the road like a tarp? If you don't blink, you might spot the platform used to propel Ultraman into the air. If you fail to see that on your first viewing, no worries, because there's no way you'll overlook the tear on Ultraman's leg in this scene. How freaking fragile were these foam rubber suits that just standing around was enough to tear them up? Were none of the 3 spare suits available to replace the damaged one for these simple close-ups? I don't know how the miniature oil refinery set from 1966 looked more convincing than this one from 1993, but here we are. In close-up, we have this guy who can't get up the collapsing platform, which is intact in the long-distance shot. Director? You want to do another take? It looks like Kimular's leg just detached itself. On second thought, don't do that. The crew might mess it up again. After all, as we already established, the crew had virtually no idea what they were doing while the show was being made.
Alright, I'm ready, come on.
Okay, here we go. Ready. And what the heck?
Hurry up.
Look, I'm just not used to these newer models, huh? Just give me a second. You just worry about your lives.
Tsuburaya actually wanted Major Havoc to film 26 episodes for the show, because they felt 13 was too short for a full season. King Wilder told them that in order to do that, they would need to double the measly $4 million for the initial 13 episodes they were asked to film. But Tsuburaya, probably still stoked about Ultraman being made in the country that made some of the most realistic films of all time, couldn't understand why $4 million wasn't enough for 26 episodes. Because we'd be making twice the number of episodes, Wilder answered. Can you imagine if they were forced to make 26 episodes for only $4 million? The budget for each episode we've already seen would have to be cut in half in order to meet their quota. Thankfully, Tsuburaya eventually backed out of the idea for a 26-episode series. Had they actually gone through with that, we wouldn't have this.
Hi!
Instead, we would have Mighty Gorga-style effects. Not that the quality of these effects were too far off from that. After all, we've got a stationary toy version of Gamora being lifted through the air. We've got monsters with wiggling horns. We've got Red King falling down a mountain that's normal-sized, while the monster is human-sized. Ultraman gets bitch-slapped by Red King, which causes the mountain to shake like it's made of paper. When a monster is killed by Ultraman, it's almost always the exact same procedure. An explosion occurs clearly a few feet in front of it, and then the kaiju disappears after a jump cut. Not a terrible effect, but a little mediocre when compared to the old-school methods. And how could I possibly forget these incredibly awful composites of Psycho Baltan inside the mothership? I feel like I'm on an acid trip just by looking at this. And why is the alien ship shaking so much?
Dun, 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 dun. Na, 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 na.